She walked into that courtroom like she owned it, which she did own half the city, but that wasn't why every head turned. She didn't look at the judge first. She didn't look at the lawyers. She walked straight to the defense table and set down an envelope. And the woman who handed it to the attorney had the kind of stillness that comes from having already made peace with the cost of what she was about to do. The opposing lawyer saw her. His expression changed. The judge's pen stopped moving. Nobody in that room knew who she was to him. Nobody knew what was in that envelope. Nobody knew she'd been awake since 2 a.m. 3 weeks ago, standing outside a burning building, watching a man walk into a basement that firefighters wouldn't enter. Not because anyone asked him to, but because that was simply who he was. She sat down in the back row, straight, quiet, ready, and the man at the defense table, the one who had asked her, once, to stay out of it, finally turned around. Their eyes met across a room where everything was about to change. Tuesday morning, 6:43 a.m., the call came in 17 minutes after Raymond Harris dropped Naya off at Eastside Elementary. He remembered the exact time because mornings in his life didn't have margins, they had sequences. Wake Naya at 5:30. Find the shoe she somehow lost between bedtime and breakfast. Always one shoe, never both. Pack her lunch while she complained that the strawberry jelly touched the bread wrong. Drive her to school with the radio off because she liked to talk in the car and he liked listening to her talk. Then, go wherever the first job sent him. This morning the first job sent him to Westridge Hills. He'd worked that neighborhood before. Twice. Both times he'd driven home feeling like his truck didn't belong on those streets, and he wasn't wrong. The roads curved around oak trees older than anyone's mortgage. The gates were wrought iron and deliberate, the kind designed to communicate something specific to people who couldn't afford them. Raymond drove past one that had a family crest welded into the center of it. An actual crest. Like someone decided a gate wasn't enough. Like the message needed to be architectural. He pulled up to the address and sat with both hands on the wheel. The house at the end of the stone path didn't look like a home. It looked like a statement. Glass and steel and clean right angles, beautiful the way things are beautiful, when they're designed to be observed rather than lived in. No flowers near the entrance. No worn place on the welcome mat. The kind of exterior that said people came for meetings, not meals. Meals. Raymond grabbed his toolbox and walked up. He didn't ring the bell. The door opened before he reached it. The woman standing in the doorway was younger than he'd expected. Early 30s, maybe. Dark jeans, cream sweater. Hair pulled back in a loose knot that suggested she'd done it quickly and hadn't thought about it since. No jewelry he could see. No makeup that he could tell. And her feet were bare on what was probably $1,000 tile, which struck him as the most interesting detail about the entire house. Her eyes were tired. Not the tired that comes from a bad night. The tired that settles in after years of watching everything closely. Careful tired. The kind that builds up slowly until the person wearing it forgets what it felt like not to carry it. You're the electrician. Raymond Harris, he held up the card. Got a call about a garage light. It's been flickering for 3 days. She stepped back from the door. It's making me insane. He followed her through a house so quiet it almost created its own sound. Everything expensive. Everything pristine. The living room furniture looked like it had been delivered, positioned by someone with a degree in spatial relations, and then never touched. The kitchen was cleaner than a showroom floor. Morning light poured through floor-to-ceiling windows and landed on surfaces that reflected it back perfectly, which meant nobody had left fingerprints anywhere, which meant either she was meticulous or she was alone. He suspected both. She led him into the garage. It was larger than his entire apartment. Polished concrete floors. Walls painted that specific shade of gray that costs more per gallon than it should. One black sedan parked in the center like a sculpture in a museum, and near the back wall, a ceiling fixture that pulsed with the slow, irregular rhythm of a dying heartbeat. Raymond set his toolbox down. Shouldn't take long. You say that like you already know what's wrong. Usually do. That got a reaction, not a smile. Something smaller. A slight shift at the corner of her mouth, like she'd considered a smile and decided against it, but the consideration itself showed. He climbed the ladder, popped the housing, found the problem in under 90 seconds. Loose wire connection at the junction. Bad original installation. The kind of error that looks catastrophic and isn't. A simple fix made complicated by whoever did shoddy work the first time. 10 minutes, she said from below him, not a question. A schedule check. Less. Good. I have a call at 8. He fixed the wire. Checked the voltage. Secured everything the right way, the way it should have been secured the first time. Climbed down, flipped the switch. The light came on clean and steady, and stayed that way. She looked up at it for a moment. Then at him. Thank you. No problem. They walked back through the house to the kitchen, and she opened a drawer and pulled out an actual checkbook, paper. The kind with carbon copies. Raymond noticed this because in 10 years of service calls, he could count on one hand the clients who still paid by check, and the ones who usually did it because they were elderly, not because they were 32, and lived in a house with automated everything. She wrote the amount without asking what it was, which meant she'd looked up the standard rate beforehand, which meant she was someone who didn't like being caught unprepared. When she handed it to him, their fingers didn't quite touch. She was careful about that. Thank you, Mr. Harris. Raymond's fine. She paused, then extended her hand properly, the way people extend hands when they've decided something. Laura. He shook it, firm, brief, professional. But there was something in the way she held herself in that half second, watchful, like she was waiting to see if he'd change now that he had her name. Some people did, got louder or softer, or started angling for something. Raymond just nodded and picked up his toolbox and headed for the front door. He figured that was it. Another job. Another wealthy client. Another house he'd forget about by noon. He was 2 steps past the threshold when her voice caught him. Can I ask you something? He turned around. She was standing in the doorway, one hand on the frame, morning light hitting her face from the side. And for the first time since he'd arrived, she didn't look polished. She looked uncertain, like someone who'd prepared for 100 different conversations, and this particular question hadn't been in any of them. Sure, a beat. Then, do you like your work? Raymond went still, not because the question was offensive, because nobody asked it. Not once in 10 years of service calls had a client stood in a doorway and asked him that. They asked if he was licensed. They asked if he could do weekends. They asked if he had a guy for plumbing, because they had a friend who needed a guy for plumbing. They asked about everything except whether the person doing the work had any feeling about the work itself. He realized he was taking too long to answer. Yeah, he said. The word came out slower than intended, like he was listening to himself say it and verifying it was true. I do. Why? He looked at the toolbox in his hand, at the house behind her, at the check she'd written from memory without having to look anything up. Because you fix something, and it stays fixed. There's something honest about that. She looked down at the tile for a moment. When she looked back up, something had moved across her face that he couldn't quite name. Not envy, not sympathy. Closer to longing. Like he'd described a country she used to know and couldn't find anymore. That must be nice, she said softly. Then she stepped back and gave him a polite nod that was also a polite ending. And the door closed between them. And Raymond stood on the stone path in the early morning cold, holding a paper check and the strange, dull weight of a conversation that should have meant nothing. He drove to his next job. He thought about her for the rest of the day. 3 days later, his phone rang during Nia's soccer practice. He was standing on the sideline with a paper cup of bad coffee in one hand, watching his daughter chase a ball with every atom of commitment a 7-year-old can produce. Nia played like each game was the only game that had ever mattered. She ran with her whole body. When she missed the ball, she threw her hands up like the laws of physics had personally wronged her. When she got close to the goal, she made a face like she was doing complicated math. He loved watching her play. His phone buzzed. Unknown number, Raymond Harris. Mr. Harris. The voice was calm, measured, the kind of calm that isn't natural, but has been practiced until it sounds natural. This is Laura Clark. You came to my home earlier this week. He recognized it immediately. Is something wrong with the light? The light is fine. A brief pause. I'm calling about something else. Nia tripped over the ball, stumbled, got back up without breaking stride, kept running. I have several properties, Laura said. 3 residential rentals, 2 commercial buildings downtown, my primary residence. They all need electrical work. Inspections, maintenance, upgrades in some places. Old wiring in others. I've been rotating through different contractors for the past 2 years and the results are inconsistent. I'd rather establish a relationship with one person who does the work correctly. Raymond said, how many properties total? 6. That was real work. Steady work. The kind of thing that didn't come along regularly. Can I ask why you're calling me specifically? There are companies that handle portfolios like that. I know. She didn't hesitate. I don't want a company. I want someone who cares whether the job is done right. A pause. You answered a question honestly on Tuesday. That's not as common as it should be. Nia came sprinting toward him from across the field, not because practice had ended, but because she'd spotted him looking at his phone and wanted to make sure he was watching. He gave her a thumbs up. She spun back around and sprinted toward the ball. Thursday afternoon, Raymond said, 2 o'clock. I can do a consultation. Thursday at 2 works. Thank you, Raymond. She hung up before he could say anything else. He stood there on the sideline with dead air in his ear, watching Nia try to negotiate possession of the ball from a girl twice her size, and thought about the word relationship in the context of a business proposal, and thought about feet bare on expensive tile, and thought, this is just a job. It was just a job. Thursday came warm for the second week of November. The kind of afternoon that felt borrowed, sky clear, air still, sunlight doing something generous with the color of the oak trees lining Westridge Hills. Raymond showed up at exactly 2 with a notebook, instead of a toolbox and his cleanest work shirt, which he'd pressed that morning with the iron Nia, used for craft projects because his actual iron had given out in September, and he hadn't replaced it yet. Laura opened the door in charcoal slacks and a silk blouse with a small ink stain near the left cuff that she either hadn't noticed or had stopped caring about. Her feet were bare again, and there was a faint smudge of something red near her right knuckle, the dried edge of paint or pigment that hadn't fully washed out. He noticed that. She led him not into the pristine main rooms this time, but into a smaller sitting room off the hallway, a space that actually suggested a person lived here. Papers on the coffee table, a laptop open with 3 browser tabs visible, a ceramic mug, leaving a ring on the wood because someone had set it down without thinking. The kind of room that happens when someone stops performing their house for a minute. She brought 2 glasses of water. Sat across from him. I appreciate you making time. No problem. He opened the notebook. Walk me through what you need. She did. Clearly, without rambling, without trying to impress him with terminology she half understood. She knew her properties. Knew which panels were original to the buildings, which had been updated when, which tenants had complained about outlets, and which complaints were probably valid. She spoke the way someone speaks when they've paid attention to a thing for years and gotten used to being the only person in the room who had. Raymond took notes and asked questions. After 20 minutes of logistics, she leaned back slightly in her chair and said something that landed differently than the rest of it. I want to be clear about what this is. This is a business arrangement. I'm not looking for friendship. I'm not looking for anything beyond competence and reliability. The words were blunt, but they came out too fast. Too practiced. Like a speech she'd delivered versions of before in different rooms, to different people, for different reasons. He met her eyes. I'm here to do good work. Nothing else. Something eased in her expression. Just a fraction. Good. Then we understand each other. They spent another half hour going over details, access codes, scheduling, the specific quirks of each property. She knew things most property owners didn't bother to learn. Which circuits tripped under certain loads, which rooms ran warm in summer, because the ventilation hadn't been updated since the building was originally constructed, which tenants were reliable and which would let him in and then disappear for 2 hours. When he stood to leave, she walked him to the front door. I'll send the addresses tonight. You can start the walkthroughs when you're ready. I'll get started Monday. He made it halfway down the stone path before she said his name. He turned. She was standing in the doorway again, one hand on the frame again, looking like she'd almost decided not to say whatever she was about to say, and then said it anyway. Was this always the plan? This work? He could have given her the short answer. People gave short answers to questions like that all the time, but something about the way she asked it, careful, like she was asking something else underneath it, made him give her the real one instead. No, I fell into it. Needed work after high school, turned out I was good at it. Then life happened. What kind of life? He almost laughed, not because it was funny, because it was a lot. Marriage, divorce, a daughter to raise, the usual version of everything going sideways at once. And before that, her voice dropped slightly. What did you want? Nobody had asked him that in years, not his mother. Not the guys he worked with. Not the woman he'd been briefly involved with 3 years ago, who'd said he was too closed off to be worth the effort, which he had filed under probably fair. He looked down at his hands for a moment. At the roughness across the knuckles. At the calluses that had built up over a decade of wrenches and ladders and junction boxes in attics that were never the right temperature. I wanted to build something. My own company. Not just service calls. Commercial contracts, a real crew. Something that had my name on it. He shrugged once. I had a partner. We saved for 2 years. $15,000 each. Enough for the business license, a van, equipment, insurance. One day I showed up to sign the LLC papers and he was gone. Moved to Arizona with his girlfriend and took all $30,000 with him. Laura went quiet. No paperwork? She asked after a moment. Nothing filed yet. Money between friends. No paper trail. He gave a short exhale. Wasn't much I could do. She looked at him steadily, the way she'd looked at him in the garage on Tuesday. Not judging, just watching. Like she was cataloging something she intended to keep. And after that I had a 2-year-old to feed. The space between them went still. Not uncomfortable, just heavy, the kind that happens when 2 people have said more than they planned to, and neither one is sure what to do with that yet. I'll send the addresses tonight, she said again, quieter this time. He nodded and left. Mr. David Cole. He drove home through traffic thinking about $30,000 and Arizona, and what it had felt like to stand outside a lawyer's office with paperwork in his hand and no one on the other side of the appointment. He drove home and picked up Nia from his mother's house and made spaghetti, and helped with a worksheet about ocean animals and read 2 chapters of a book about a girl who talked to horses. And even later, when the apartment had gone quiet and Nia was asleep, and he was sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of water, and the day winding down, he kept thinking about a woman standing in a doorway, asking what he used to want before everything happened. Nobody asked questions like that unless they had answers they were still figuring out themselves. He started the walkthroughs the following Monday. 2 weeks of it. Early mornings at the rental houses, afternoons at the commercial buildings, fitting everything around his regular client schedule and Nia's pickup at 3:15. Laura gave him codes and keys and largely stayed out of the way. When she was home, she worked from the kitchen or took calls in a room down the hall. Present, but not intrusive. A quiet acknowledgement that she'd hired someone competent and didn't need to supervise competence. The rental houses were straightforward. Old panels that needed updating, outlets that hadn't been touched since the previous decade, lighting fixtures that were functional, but barely. The commercial buildings were more complicated. One had a panel configuration that made him stop and stare for 5 minutes, because whoever had signed off on it the first time had made decisions that were technically legal and practically baffling. Then there was the guest wing. He'd saved it for the end of his first week at the main house, mostly because everything else in the house was so deliberately curated that he expected the same. Neutral colors, clean surfaces, expensive emptiness. The door to the guest wing was slightly different from the others, heavier, and when he knocked and pushed it open, the smell hit him before the sight did. Paint and clay and something organic, almost like soil after rain. The kind of smell that means work has been happening in a space for a long time. He stopped in the doorway, canvases everywhere, stacked against the walls in overlapping rows. Easels near the windows, 3 of them, each holding something in a different stage of completion. Shelves running the length of one wall, packed with brushes and paint tubes and mason jars clouded with dirty water. A pottery wheel in the corner with 2 unfinished bowls drying on a wire rack nearby. Drop cloths over the floor, paint-stained and layered with history. The room looked like a person's mind made physical. He should have looked at the ceiling fixture. That was why he was here. The lighting was reportedly inadequate for detail work, which he could see immediately was true. A single overhead can throwing a pool of yellow light that faded to shadow before it reached the far wall. Instead, he looked at the painting near the back, large canvas, maybe 4 feet across. Blues that weren't quite any shade of blue he'd seen before. Darker than navy, lighter than black, something in between that felt pressurized. Gray streaks cutting through at angles. The brushwork aggressive and layered, like someone had gone back to the same passage again and again, adding rather than correcting, pushing something toward the surface rather than revealing it. It looked like weather, like a storm that wanted out of its own frame. Those are private. He turned fast. Laura was standing in the doorway behind him, arms folded across her chest, expression unreadable, not angry, something more controlled than anger, the face of someone who had come in expecting a room and found a conversation instead. He kept his voice level. "I'm sorry. I knocked. I was looking at the lighting in here." She didn't respond immediately. He held up his notebook and kept going, because filling silence with professionalism was a skill he'd developed over a decade of walking into other people's spaces. "You were right that it's inadequate. For detail work, you'd want something adjustable. Track lighting you can aim, color accurate. Better coverage across the whole space, not just the center. You know about art lighting. I know about lighting. Had a photographer client for 3 years. Picked up a few things." She studied him, then walked toward one of the easels, not the one with the unfinished piece, the empty one, and adjusted the angle of it by a degree that didn't need adjusting. Hands needed something to do. Add it to the proposal. Already have. He made a note. "I'll put together specs tonight." He turned toward the door. She was still standing there. "Can I ask you something?" He paused. You looked at it for a while. She meant the large canvas. She was looking at the floor now, not at him. "What did you see?" Raymond considered the question seriously. Not the polite version. The actual one. "Something trying to get out," he said. "The way the brushwork layers on itself. Like whatever's in there keeps getting pushed back down and keeps coming up anyway." Silence. When he looked at her, her expression had shifted. Not dramatically. A small rearrangement of something around the eyes. "Nobody else has been in this room," she said. Flat, factual. Not a complaint, just information. He nodded once and left. The work began properly the following week. He let himself in with the access code each morning, set up in whatever room he was working on, and got to it. Laura maintained the professional distance she'd established from the beginning. Present in the house, but not in the same rooms, acknowledging him when their paths crossed in the hallway, without making it into a thing. Then the small things started changing, not dramatically. Nothing that would register as meaningful from the outside. A glass of water appeared on the counter near his toolbox one afternoon, without explanation. He drank it, left the glass, found it washed and back in its spot the next day. Another afternoon she materialized briefly in the doorway of the room he was working in and asked, with no particular tone, if the older wiring in the east side of the house was a code issue or just an aesthetic one. He explained the difference. She listened the way someone listens who's actually going to retain the information. After that, she started asking more. Not constantly. Not intrusively. But while he was working, she'd appear occasionally with a question that was actually technical, about load calculations, about what certain upgrades would and wouldn't accomplish, about whether the panel configuration in the second commercial building was as bad as it appeared, or if he was exaggerating to justify the scope of the repair. "I'm not exaggerating," he told her. "Whoever signed off on that panel was either uninformed or in a hurry. Probably both. There's a third option," she said from the doorway. "They were being paid by someone who didn't want the real answer." He looked up from the junction box. "You've had that happen?" "Twice." She said it like it was weather. Like facts about the world that weren't personal, just present. "Both times in the early years when I didn't know enough to ask the right questions." He went back to the wiring. What did you do? Learned the right questions. She paused and stopped hiring the people who gave me the wrong answers. He didn't respond. But he thought about it for the rest of that day. On a Thursday afternoon toward the end of his second week at the main house, Patricia Harris arrived to pick up Nia from school and swung by the property on the way back because Raymond had an overrun on the kitchen panel that was going to take another hour, and he'd texted his mother, rather than leave Nia waiting at pickup. It was the kind of solution that didn't require discussion. His mother had a key to Laura's access code on her phone. From the day Raymond had asked her to hold it as backup, and Laura had told him from the beginning to treat the access like his own. Nia walked in holding a drawing she'd made at school, looked around the hallway with the comprehensive attention of a child, cataloging a new environment, and followed the sound of Raymond's work to the kitchen. But while he was finishing up, his mother waited in the sitting room off the hallway with Nia, and Nia, as Nia always did in any space she entered, began to explore. She found the guest wing door. It was slightly open. Raymond had been working in the adjacent utility room and hadn't fully latched it when he came back out. Krya pushed it wider and stepped inside and stood in the middle of all those canvases, and breathed in paint and clay and said nothing for almost a full minute. Laura came in from the back of the house and found her there. They had a brief conversation. Nia asked questions, and Laura answered them, which was the only dynamic Nia ever accepted from an adult. And by the time Raymond came to collect his daughter, Nia had learned that the big blue painting was of a feeling that didn't have a name yet, and that the pottery wheel made bowls that were only interesting when they weren't perfect, and that the person who worked in this room spent most of her time trying to say things that didn't have words. Raymond thanked Laura for the patience. Laura said it was fine. He gathered Nia's things and left. He didn't know that his daughter had filed every detail of that room, and the woman in it, in the permanent section of her memory where she kept things that mattered. He finished the guest wing lighting on a Friday afternoon in late November. Trank system. 12 individual heads, fully adjustable, each one aimed at a different zone of the space. Color temperature he'd spaced based on research into what painters actually needed, not just what looked good in a showroom. He spent an extra 40 minutes making sure the wiring was clean and hidden, and that none of the mounting hardware was visible from below. When he switched it on, the room changed. Every canvas lit up differently. The blues in the large painting near the back went from muted to luminous. The unfinished pieces on the easels showed details that hadn't been visible before. The shadows softened, and the color on the drop cloths even seemed warmer. The room went from a space where work happened in spite of the light to a space where work could happen because of it. He stood there for a moment. Not for any professional reason, just because it was worth standing in for a moment. Oh, Laura was in the doorway. He hadn't heard her come in. She walked slowly into the room, turning once in the center of it, looking at each zone, at each canvas, at the way the light fell differently on different surfaces. Her expression was the most unguarded he'd seen it. Not soft exactly, but open, the way a face looks when it stops filtering for a few seconds. "It's exactly right," she said quietly. "I didn't know it was possible for it to feel like this. It's functional," he said. "But it can be both." She turned and looked at him in a way that did something specific to his chest that he elected not to examine too closely. No distance, no professional register, just her face and whatever was in it. "Thank you, Raymond." He nodded once, started packing up his tools. He was almost done when she appeared in the kitchen doorway, holding 2 glasses of wine. "It's after 6. She set one on the counter near his toolbox. "You're off the clock." He looked at the glass. Looked at her. "Are you trying to break your own rules?" A pause. Then, probably, he set down his tool bag. They didn't sit. Sitting would have made it into something, and neither of them was ready to name what it was trying to become. She leaned against the counter on one side. He stood on the other. The kitchen had gone dim without either of them noticing. The sun finished, and the under-cabinet lights doing the work now. And in that lower register, everything looked less like a showroom and more like a room. She was different in it. less like whatever the world saw when they heard her name or saw her company on a list somewhere. More like the person who painted storms and couldn't get the light right until today. "This doesn't feel like just electrical work anymore," he said. "No." Her voice came out lower than usual. "It doesn't." He set his glass on the counter. "So what is it?" She looked into her wine for a moment. "I'm not sure. And I'm usually sure about everything, which is part of what's disorienting about this." "You made that speech," he said. "The first day. Business arrangement. No friendship. No connection. I know what I said. You said it like you'd said it before." That landed. He could see it land. "I have," she admitted. After a moment, different rooms, different situations. Same speech. It's a preemptive thing. A line I draw before someone else gets to draw it differently. Who tried to draw it differently? She looked up at him. Not sharply. Thoughtfully. Like she was deciding how much of an answer the question deserved. People who found out what I was worth in dollars before they found out what I was. And once someone knows that number, it's the only thing they see. Every conversation, every gesture, every offer to help. They're looking at the number and pretending to look at the person. Raymond said, "Tell me something true." She blinked. "What?" "You keep asking me questions, real ones. Your turn." A long moment. The kind where a person decides. I built everything I have to prove something to people who can no longer hear it. She said it to the counter, not to him, like the sentence needed a place to land that wasn't a face. My father thought business was for men. Said it to me directly. When I was 16, he sat across from me at a dinner table and explained, very reasonably, that my job in life was to support someone important, not to become someone important myself. So I went and built the company, made more money than he ever imagined, and by the time I had done it, he was gone. My mother had been gone the year before. She gave a short, broken sound that was almost a laugh. "I have all of this and nobody left I built it for." Raymond looked at her for a long time. "That sounds lonely," he said. "It is." He moved away from the counter and without deciding to, he took 2 steps toward her, close enough that the conversation changed register. She didn't step back. "Celeste." He started. "Laura." She said it quietly. "Celeste is the company. Laura Celeste Clark. My family called me Laura. Before. A breath. You're the only person outside of paperwork who's heard that in a long time." He held that. "Laura." He tried it. It fit somehow. More than the other one. She set her wine glass down on the counter with a small sound. And when she looked back up at him, the professional distance was gone. All of it. And what was there instead? Was just a person who was exhausted from maintaining a life at arm's length from everything that might actually matter. "I built my whole life," she said, "around never needing anyone. It kept me safe." A pause. The kind that fills with everything that hasn't been said. "I'm tired of being safe." The room went completely still. He knew all the reasons to step back. She was a client. She was from a world so removed from his that the distance between their zip codes might as well have been a different country. He was a 38-year-old electrician with a 7-year-old daughter who slept on the sofa because their apartment only had 1 bedroom. He had $30,000 in savings that a former friend had taken to Arizona 4 years ago and never replaced. He had enough stability for things to stay level as long as nothing went wrong, which meant he had no cushion for anything that might. He knew all of that, and none of it was what he felt. What he felt was her, the exhaustion in her voice, and the way she still held her shoulders squared, as if she might need to retreat at any second. The way she'd stood in a doorway and asked a maintenance worker what he wanted from life, because she was someone who asked real questions to everyone except herself. He took another step. She didn't move. "Laura." He said her name a second time because it was new and because she'd given it to him like it meant something. "You can still tell me to go." She looked at him for what felt like a long time. Then she whispered, "Stay." Neither of them could have said who moved first. One moment there was distance. The next her hand was against his chest, and his was at her waist, and she was looking up at him with nothing careful left in her face at all. Just want. Just honesty. Just 2 people who had both spent a long time not letting themselves have anything uncertain. "This is not a good idea." Her voice barely registered. "Probably not. You work for me, I know. This gets complicated. It already is." She pulled him down and the conversation ended. And something else started. Something that didn't have words yet. Something that felt like the first honest thing either of them had done in longer than they could comfortably admit. Later, much later, lying in a room he'd never seen before. Soft bookshelves along one wall, fireplace casting low orange light, a worn leather couch and an old mug on the side table, and the particular warmth of a space that got used. He stared at the ceiling and listened to the quiet of her house. It was not his quiet. His quiet had traffic underneath it, and a neighbor who walked heavily, and Nia talking in her sleep some nights. This was different. Deeper. The kind of quiet that cost something. Laura lay beside him, one hand resting lightly on his chest, like she was checking something. "This doesn't feel real," she said into the dark. "It is, you sound certain. I'm certain it happened." Everything after that, I have no idea, she almost smiled. He could feel it against his shoulder more than see it. That's honest, trying to be, a long quiet. "Then tell me something true." He looked at the ceiling. "I'm scared all the time, that I'm not doing enough for Nia, that I'm so deep in keeping things running that one day she grows up and what she remembers is a father who was always tired." He felt her shift. The quality of her attention changed. "She won't remember that," she said, quietly but firmly. "She'll remember that you stayed." He swallowed once. "Your turn," he said. She was quiet long enough that he thought she might redirect. "But then, nobody has ever asked me if I liked something before you." "On Tuesday," she said it carefully, like she was testing the weight of each word. "Not what I'd accomplished, not what I was planning, just whether I liked the work." A breath. I couldn't answer, because I realized I'd spent so long building what my father said I couldn't have, that I'd forgotten to ask myself if it was what I wanted. He turned his head to look at her. "Do you?" he asked. "Like it?" She thought about it. Actually thought. "Some of it. The part where you see a property no one believed in and you make it work. That part, yes." A pause. "The rest of it feels like maintaining proof of something to a court that stopped being in session a long time ago." He reached over and found her hand in the dark. "We're a mess," she said. "Yeah, this is a terrible idea. Already established. I don't do this. A beat. I don't let people. She stopped. "I don't know what to do with someone who doesn't want the number." "I'm not interested in the number," he said. "I don't think I could tell you what it is." She laughed then. Short and real, surprised out of her. He fell asleep to the sound of her breathing, and to the quiet of a house that was starting, very slowly, to feel less like a statement and more like somewhere a person lived. He woke before 6. He lay still for a moment, aware of exactly where he was and exactly what had happened and exactly what the morning required of him. This was a skill he'd developed over 7 years of single parenthood. The ability to go from asleep to fully operational without transition. Because transition was a luxury he didn't have, when there was a person who depended on him to be functional before she was even awake. He sat up. Laura stirred. "What time is it?" 6. Maybe just before. She blinked at him. Still half asleep, hair loose across the pillow, looking like none of the things the world knew her as. "Okay, my mom has Nia. I said I'd pick her up early, then go. No drama in it. No negotiation, just clarity." He looked at her. "That's it? What else should it be?" A conversation. Regret. Someone saying this was a mistake. She looked at him steadily. "Was it?" The answer came before he decided to give it. "No, neither do I." She sat up slightly. "Raymond, your daughter comes first." She should. "I would never ask you to change that." He looked at her for a long moment, and something inside him shifted. Something he couldn't name exactly, but that felt important and solid, like a junction properly secured. He got dressed, found his things. At the bedroom door, he turned back. What happens now? She thought about it without deflecting for the first time. "I don't want to pretend this didn't happen. Whatever it is, neither do I." She stood, crossed the room, kissed him once. Not tentative, not apologetic. "Go be a father. Come back tonight if you want to." He looked at her for one more moment. "I'll want to." He drove to his mother's house with his mind split cleanly in half. One half already running the day. Nia, breakfast, the Saturday schedule, the work he'd promised a client on Monday. The other half, still standing in a kitchen in Westridge Hills next to a woman who'd asked him to stay in a voice that sounded like the first honest thing she'd done in years. His mother opened the door before he knocked. She looked at his face and narrowed her eyes, in that specific way she had, the expression that meant she'd already gathered information from the available evidence and was now waiting for confirmation. "You look like something complicated happened." He stepped inside. "Morning, Mom." That's not a denial. From the kitchen, his daughter's voice, "Daddy," and then Nia, running, arms out, talking before she'd fully finished crossing the room. Grandma let her have hot chocolate. She watched a movie about penguins. She slept in her school clothes because she forgot to change. She lost her purple sock again, the left one, and could he look for it in his truck, because she thought it might be in his truck. He picked her up and held her, and let the weight of her settle him the way it always did. This was the center. This had always been the center. But for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like the only thing left. Over Naya's shoulder, his mother watched him with an expression he knew. The one that said, "We'll talk about this later, and I'll probably be right about whatever I say." He kissed the top of Nia's head and told her they'd find the sock, and yes, they could have pancakes. And underneath all of it, quiet and present and slightly terrifying, was the knowledge that something had started. He hadn't looked for it. He hadn't planned for it. He'd gone to fix a flickering light and stayed somewhere he hadn't meant to stay and come home different. Not worse, just different. 3 days later, Raymond's phone rang while he was running wire in the attic of a house in Dakota. He almost didn't answer. Unknown number. He'd been getting spam calls all week, the automated kind that started talking before he could say hello. He answered, "Raymond Harris." A pause. Then a voice he hadn't heard in 5 years. Certain voices don't change. Certain voices sit in a specific register in your memory, and when you hear them again, you know exactly who it is before the name arrives, before any processing happens, before you have time to brace. He knew before she said it. It's Deja, a beat. Deja Brooks. "I want to talk about Nia." The attic was hot. Insulation scratching at his wrists. He'd been up here for 40 minutes and had another 20 to go. He said, "What do you want?" Not a question. A statement with a question mark missing. I know this is out of nowhere. She'd prepared for this conversation. He could hear the preparation in the measured pace, the practiced calm. "I've been in therapy. I've been working through what happened. I'm different now, Raymond. I'm stable. I got married last year. We have a house. A real home." He didn't say anything. "I want to be in Nia's life." Her voice cracked on the name in a way that might have been genuine, might have been practiced, might have been both. "She's my daughter. I made a terrible mistake, leaving the way I did, and I know that. I'm not trying to erase what you've built with her. I just want to. You left her when she was 2 years old." Silence. "You left her," he said again. "She doesn't know your voice. She's never once asked about you. You know why? Because I've been there every day since you walked out, and she has never had a reason to notice the gap, Raymond. What do you want?" Specifically, another breath. When she answered, the preparation was gone, and something colder was there instead. "My husband is a lawyer. His name is Thomas Jackson. He's going to file a petition for joint custody. His office will contact you next week." The attic heat pressed in. "I'll tell her about you one day," Raymond said, "on my terms. When she's ready. Not because a judge told me I had to. That won't be your decision anymore. Not cruel, clinical, the way certain facts are delivered when the person delivering them has already made peace with what they are. I'll see you in court, Raymond." The line went dead. He stood in the attic for a long moment. Didn't move. The insulation was still scratching at his wrists. The junction box was halfway finished in front of him. Somewhere below him, the homeowner was probably wondering why it had gone quiet. He thought about Naya at the kitchen table doing her ocean animal worksheet. He thought about the purple sock missing from her left foot. He thought about the way she said, "Daddy," when she ran across a room, like the word was also an exhale, like getting to say it was its own relief. He thought about a petition for joint custody, filed by a woman with a lawyer husband, and a house with a real backyard, and 5 years of documented absence, and he thought about an 800-square-foot apartment where his daughter slept on the sofa because they couldn't afford a 2-bedroom, and he thought about what a home study was going to say when it looked at his life, and Laura Clark's life and Deja Brooks's life all on the same page. He picked up the phone. He called Laura. She answered on the second ring. "Hey, I was going to." Nia's mother called silence. "She left when Nia was 2, he said." The words came out steadier than he expected. "She's been gone 5 years. No calls, no cards, nothing. Now she's married to a lawyer named Thomas Jackson, and they want joint custody." He exhaled. "She said she'd see me in court." Laura didn't speak immediately. He could hear her breathing, hear her processing it. Then, "I have lawyers. Good ones. Let me—" "No, Raymond, I can't." He said it firmly, not harshly. "If I take money from you, Thomas Jackson is going to stand in front of a judge and say I'm using you, that I'm chasing a billionaire instead of taking care of my daughter. It doesn't matter if it's true. It matters how it looks." A breath. "And right now I can't afford for anything to look wrong." Laura's voice went very quiet. "So what are you saying?" He closed his eyes. "I'm saying we need to stop. Until this is finished." A long pause. "The kind that has weight, I understand," she said finally, her voice careful and level and doing the thing it did when she was keeping something contained. "Nia comes first." "She should. This isn't. You don't have to explain." A breath. "I hope you win, Raymond." The line went quiet. He was the one who heard the silence first and understood it was finished. He sat in the hot attic with a half-finished junction box in front of him and the sound of a call ending still in his ear, and thought about a woman who'd spent her whole life making things safe for herself, and had finally stopped, and thought about what he'd just asked her to do. And then he climbed back down and went back to work. Because that was what he did. Because that was what he had always done. Because there was a 7-year-old girl who needed him to do it. And that had been true every single day for 5 years. And it was still true now. And it would be true tomorrow. And nothing that had happened in the last 3 weeks changed that at all. It just made it harder to carry alone. The week after Dadge's call had no clean shape to it. Raymond worked. That was the shape. Wake up. Feed Nia. Drop her at school. Work until 3:10. Pick her up, make dinner, help with homework, read until she fell asleep. Sit at the kitchen table afterward in the quiet and stare at whatever was in front of him without actually seeing it. He didn't call Laura. She didn't call him, which was what he'd asked for. Which was correct. Which he understood completely on every rational level, and which felt, in the evenings, like something missing from the air. The way a room feels after furniture has been removed, and the walls still hold the outline of what used to be there. He kept working. He finished the last of the commercial building upgrades on a Wednesday. Sent the invoice through the property management contact Laura had set up rather than to her directly, because that felt like the right distance, because maintaining the right distance was what this required, because Nia needed him to keep his head clear and not confuse things that felt real with things that were safe to act on right now. He got a confirmation receipt from the management software. Automated. No message attached. That was fine. That was correct. He went home and made Nia's favorite dinner, the pasta with butter and too much parmesan, and let her talk for 40 minutes straight about a disagreement she'd had with her best friend over got to be the queen in a game they'd invented, a game that had apparently been running for 3 weeks and had its own mythology, and 3 characters who had died and come back, and 1 character who was a talking rock. He listened to every word, because listening was what he had, and right now it was enough. Sandra Anderson's office was on the 4th floor of a building in Midtown that had a coffee machine in the lobby that didn't work, and fluorescent lighting that flickered in exactly the way Raymond knew how to fix, but wasn't there to fix. The public defender's intake waiting room had a row of plastic chairs and a TV mounted too high on the wall, showing a cable news segment with the sound off, and 3 other people who all looked like they were carrying the specific weight of a legal situation they hadn't planned for. Raymond sat in one of the chairs and waited. Sandra Anderson came out herself to get him. Mid-40s, tired eyes that had graduated past, tired into something more permanent. The expression of someone who had seen the full range of how systems could fail, and had stopped being surprised by any particular example of it. She wore a dark blazer and carried a file that was thicker than Raymond had expected. He sat across from her in her office, and she opened the file and read for 30 seconds without speaking. Then she looked up. "Mr. Harris, I'm going to be direct with you. Please. Your case is weak." He'd been half expecting it, but hearing it still landed differently than expecting it. "I've raised Nia alone for 5 years," he said. Deja Brooks left when she was 2. No contact, no support payments. Nothing, I know. Sandra's voice was even. Not without sympathy, just accurate. And here is what the other side has. Deja Brooks has completed documented therapy for postpartum depression. She's been in treatment for 3 years, with a licensed psychologist whose records, we've already been informed, exist and are available. She remarried 11 months ago to Thomas Jackson, who is a practicing attorney at Morrison & Blake with 14 years of family law experience. They own a 4-bedroom home in Buckhead, 2-income household, stable neighborhood, good school district, Raymond said. She abandoned her daughter. She had a medical condition. Sandra set down the file. Postpartum depression is recognized by the court as a medical reality. Her absence is going to be framed as a health crisis she's recovered from, not as willful abandonment. That framing is legally valid, and judges hear it regularly. She paused. That's not me saying it's fair. I'm telling you how it's going to be presented. The fluorescent light in Sandra's office hummed faintly. Raymond had the professional awareness of exactly what was causing that hum and what would fix it. His brain cataloged it automatically, the way it cataloged everything electrical, while the rest of him sat in a plastic chair and absorbed what he was being told. "What do I need?" he asked. "Character witnesses. People who can testify to your relationship with Nia in specific, concrete terms. Not just that you're a good father. Anyone can say that. People who have observed your parenting directly. Teachers, coaches, neighbors, pediatrician. Anyone who has seen you with your daughter in contexts that demonstrate consistent, active involvement. My mother. Family members carry less weight. Not 0, less." She tapped the file. "We need people from outside your immediate circle. People who have no personal interest in the outcome." She looked at him steadily. "And Mr. Harris, one more thing." He waited. "If there is anything in your personal life that Thomas Jackson could characterize as instability, irresponsibility, or poor judgment, I need to know about it now, not at the hearing." Now, Laura's face came to mind with a precision he hadn't authorized. He chose each word carefully. "There was someone I was seeing. A client. We stopped when this situation started, because I was concerned about how it might look." Sandra's expression didn't change. "Who is the person?" "Laura Clark. Harmon Properties, a beat. Just one. Celeste Harmon. She goes by Laura. Celeste is the company name." Sandra wrote something in the file. "And the relationship ended when?" "The day Deja called." "You ended it?" "Yes, because you were concerned about how Thomas Jackson would use it." "Yes." Sandra wrote another note. "That was the correct call." She closed the file. "Keep it that way. Jackson will have done background research on you. He may already know about her. If he does and you were still involved, he would use it to paint you as someone prioritizing an inappropriate relationship over your daughter's stability." She looked at him directly. "The fact that you ended it when you did suggests good judgment. If it comes up, we address it honestly." Raymond nodded. "The first hearing is in 3 weeks," Sandra said. "I'll file our response today. Start thinking about those witnesses." He left her office and walked out into the gray November afternoon and sat in his truck for 2 full minutes before starting it. 3 weeks. He started the engine and went to pick up Nia. That evening, while Nia worked on a drawing at the kitchen table and Raymond heated up leftover soup, she said without looking up from her paper, "Daddy, yeah, are you sad?" He turned from the stove. She was still focused on her drawing, a serious expression on her face, crayon moving in careful strokes. "Why do you ask that?" "Because you're quiet, a beat. You're always quiet now. Different quiet, 7 years old. Already reading the temperature of a room with the sensitivity of someone twice at her age." He walked over and crouched down beside her chair, so they were at the same level. "I'm dealing with some grown-up stuff," he said. "Nothing you need to worry about." She kept drawing. Then, carefully, not looking up, "Is it about the lady with all the paint colors?" His chest tightened. "You mean the lady you visited with Grandma?" Nia nodded, still working the crayon. "She had a painting of something. that looked like a storm, but it was blue. I asked her what it was, and she said it was a feeling she hadn't figured out how to name yet. I liked that answer. Raymond looked at his daughter for a moment. "We're not seeing her anymore," he said. Nia's crayon stopped. She looked at her drawing, not at him. Because of the grown-up stuff? Yes, she absorbed this. Then she put down the crayon, turned, and hugged him hard, both arms around his neck, her face pressed against his shoulder, and didn't say anything. Just held on. 7 years old, and already understanding that sometimes the right response to a complicated thing isn't words. He held her back. "I love you, Nia Bean. Love you more," she said into his shoulder. They stayed like that for a while. The soup got a little too warm on the stove. Neither of them moved. 2 weeks of silence followed. Then, 11 days before the first hearing, his phone buzzed at 11:43 p.m. on a Tuesday. He was awake. He'd been awake for an hour, lying on his side of the bed, which was the whole bed, which had always been the whole bed, but felt more specifically like a side now, which was information he filed without examining. Staring at the ceiling and running numbers in his head. What a home study was going to find at his address. What the square footage comparison was going to look like in a formal report. What it meant that his daughter slept on a fold-out sofa. Because the bedroom was hers, and he'd never quite managed to find a 2-bedroom in this neighborhood at a price that worked. The message was from a number he recognized, even though he'd promised himself he wasn't keeping track. "I hope you're okay." 3 weeks of nothing, and that was what she opened with. Not a demand, not a claim, just 3 words that assumed the best and offered it without conditions. He stared at the screen for a long time. Then he typed, "Not really." The 3 dots appeared immediately, like she'd been waiting, like she was awake too. Me neither. He watched the dots appear and disappear twice, and then, "I miss you." His chest did something he'd been managing successfully for 11 days by keeping his schedule too full to feel it directly. He typed, "I miss you too." Then, before he could think about it too long, "But nothing's changed." "I know." A longer pause. Then, "Good luck at the hearing, whenever it is." He set the phone on the nightstand and looked at the ceiling. She'd said whenever it is, not because she didn't know when. Because she was giving him the information that she wasn't tracking the calendar, that she wasn't waiting, that she understood what he'd asked of her and was honoring it without making him feel the weight of it, which, somehow, made him feel the weight of it more. He fell asleep eventually, later than usual, but he slept. The courthouse on Capitol Avenue smelled like floor cleaner and recycled air, and something else that had no specific source, but that Raymond associated specifically with institutional buildings. The accumulated weight of people sitting in plastic chairs, waiting for decisions to be made about their lives. Sandra met him in the hallway outside courtroom 4B. She looked him over once, her expression neutral, but her eyes noting the suit. The fact that it didn't quite fit right across the shoulders. The relative quality of his shoes compared to what was about to walk through the door on the other side. "Don't volunteer information," she said. "Answer what's asked. Stay calm regardless of what you hear." "And Raymond," she held his gaze, "she's going to look good in there. That's not an accident. Don't let it shake you." He nodded. The doors opened. Deja Brooks. She was Deja to him. She would always be Deja to him. Walked in with her husband at her side, and she looked nothing like the person he'd been carrying in his memory for 5 years. That person was wearing sweats and standing in a doorway at 6 a.m., telling him she couldn't do this anymore, telling him she needed to go, telling him Nia would be better without her, in a voice that he'd understood even then was partly true and partly a story. She was telling herself to make it possible to leave. This person wore a tailored dress the color of slate, hair professionally styled, makeup precise. She sat in the gallery with her shoulders back and her hands folded, and the composed expression of someone who had been coached, which she had, which was smart, which he would have done too. Thomas Jackson sat beside her. Tall, confident in the specific way that people are confident when they've spent 14 years winning arguments in rooms exactly like this one. He didn't look at Raymond when they entered. The lawyer who stood up when the judge entered was not Thomas. Thomas was there as husband. The litigation was handled by a man named Jeffrey Lewis, who had a briefcase that probably cost more than Raymond's monthly rent, and the smooth, unhurried manner of someone who had delivered bad news so many times it had stopped requiring preparation. Judge Deborah White took the bench. She was in her mid-50s, reading glasses already on, and she had the focused economy of movement of someone who had seen the full range of custody disputes and had developed a strong immunity to performances of any kind. Case number 2024, FC 8847. Brooks versus Harris. Petition for modification of parental rights. Jeffrey Lewis stood first. He was good. Raymond had to acknowledge that. He presented Deeja's case the way a carpenter presents a finished piece of furniture, with attention to the joins, to the places where the work was solid, without drawing attention to what it had taken to get there. Deeja had suffered from postpartum depression, a documented and recognized medical condition. She had spent 3 years in treatment. She had rebuilt her life responsibly and with intention. She had married a stable partner, established a secure home, and was now, by every measurable standard, prepared to be the mother she had not been able to be when Nia was born. "My client is not here to take Nia away from her father," Jeffrey said, looking at the judge with the practiced sincerity of someone whose sincerity had been practiced. "She is here to be a part of her daughter's life. Supervised visitation leading to joint custody. A chance to build what she wasn't able to build before." Deeja dabbed at her eyes at the right moment. Thomas put his hand over hers. Sandra stood. She was less polished than Jeffrey Lewis. Deliberately so, Raymond suspected. She spoke in the direct, unhurried way of someone whose credibility came from accuracy rather than performance. Raymond Harris had been Nia's sole caregiver since she was 26 months old. Not a co-parent, not a primary parent with the other parent present somewhere. Sole. He had not missed a parent-teacher conference, a pediatric appointment, a school event. He had built his daughter's life from the ground up with his own resources, without support from the woman who was now petitioning to participate in that life. "Mr. Harris has given Nia a stable, loving home," Sandra said. "He has done this alone, for 5 years. That is not something a court order created. It is something he chose every day." Judge White made a note, looked at Raymond. "Mr. Harris, would you like to address the court?" He stood, his voice came out level. He hadn't rehearsed it. "It was just true, Your Honor. I'm not going to tell you my life is perfect. My apartment is 800 square feet. Nia sleeps on the sofa because there's only one bedroom. I work 60 to 70 hours a week when the work is available." He paused. "But I have been there, every day. Every school drop-off and every pickup and every nightmare and every lost shoe and every homework assignment and every conversation about why the rules are the rules. That was my choice. Not because a court told me to, because she's my daughter." He looked briefly at Deeja, not with anger, with something more complicated than that. "She's going to know who her mother is. I've planned on telling her when she's old enough to understand what happened without it becoming the thing that defines her. That was always the plan." He looked back at the judge. "But a judge deciding that timeline is different from me deciding it. And I'm asking this court to consider who has been in that room every single night." Judge White wrote something. Set down her pen. "I've read the petition and the response," she said. "I want a home study conducted on both residences. Social services will evaluate Mr. Harris's home and the Brooks residence and submit a formal report. We'll reconvene in 3 weeks." She looked at both parties. "In the interim, Nia remains in Mr. Harris's primary custody. Ms. Brooks, you may apply through my clerk for supervised visitation at a neutral location. 2 hours, twice monthly, until the next hearing." The gavel came down. Sandra put a hand on Raymond's arm. "We knew this was coming. Home study isn't the end." He looked at the wall. "Her house has 4 bedrooms and a backyard. Mine has 1 bedroom and a parking lot. The home study considers more than square footage." He didn't argue. Because Sandra was right that it considered more than square footage. And she was also right that square footage was going to be on the report. And he knew what side of that comparison he was on. He picked up his jacket and walked out of the courtroom into the fluorescent-lit hallway and through the lobby and out into the cold Atlanta afternoon. His phone showed a text from his mother. "How did it go?" He typed, "Not good. Tell you later." Then he put the phone in his pocket and stood on the courthouse steps and breathed in cold air for a long moment. He went to pick up Nia. Patricia Harris showed up the next morning with a foil-covered pan of something that smelled like butter and brown sugar, which meant she was worried. Because Patricia Harris cooked when she was worried, the way other people paced or cleaned. She sat at Raymond's kitchen table and watched him make coffee and waited for him to talk. He talked. She listened to the whole thing. The hearing, the home study order, the comparison between his apartment and the 4-bedroom in Buckhead. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "What about Laura Clark?" she asked. He looked at the coffee pot. "We stopped." "Since when?" "Since the day Dija called. His mother absorbed this." "Because you thought it would hurt the case." "Because I know it would hurt the case." She was quiet for another moment. Then she stood and walked to the window that looked out at the parking lot below and looked at it, without seeing it the way people look at things, when they're really looking at something else entirely. "Your father died when you were 12, she said. "You remember that?" "Of course I remember." "You remember what I did after?" He knew where this was going. He let her go. "I worked 3 jobs for 4 years. Cleaned offices at night, waited tables on weekends, took in alterations from the neighbors. I did all of it so you could have things. Not just necessities, things, experiences, the kind that build a person." She turned from the window and looked at him. "Not because I had to. Because I wanted your life to be bigger than survival. I wanted you to understand that survival was the floor, not the ceiling." Raymond set down his coffee. "You're doing the same thing for Nia. I see it every time I'm here. That child doesn't know what it feels like to be forgotten." His mother crossed the room and put her hand on his shoulder, the specific gesture she'd had since he was a child, the one that meant, "I'm saying something important now, so pay attention." "But Raymond, you are also a person, and people need more than duty to stay whole." He didn't answer. "If this woman makes you a better version of yourself," Patricia said, "that's not a distraction from Nia. That's something she gets to grow up watching." He looked at the floor for a moment. His mother removed her hand and went back to the foil pan and started explaining the instructions for reheating it. And he let her, because some conversations end best when they're not extended. The social services assessor arrived on a Thursday morning. Her name was Patricia Glenn. Different Patricia, which Raymond filed away as one of those minor coincidences that meant nothing. And she was professional and methodical, and arrived with a clipboard and the specific expression of someone who had done this many times and tried hard to bring genuine neutrality to it, rather than letting the accumulated weight of what she'd seen prejudge what she was seeing now. She went through every room. Raymond had cleaned everything already, the specific cleaning that comes from anxiety rather than from actual dirt. The kind where you rewash things that were already clean and organize things that were already organized. Nia's side of the living room, where the fold-out sofa was currently folded back into sofa form, had Nia's books stacked neatly on the shelf they'd built together from a kit last spring. Her drawings covered the refrigerator and one section of the hallway wall, which Raymond had mounted with those poster strips because he'd wanted them at her eye level. Her soccer cleats were by the door, muddy from Tuesday's practice, which was authentic if not photogenic. Patricia Glenn wrote things on her clipboard. She noted the square footage. She noted the sleeping arrangement. She noted the kitchen, which was functional, and the bathroom, which was clean, and the general state of a home that was small and maintained and contained, by his estimate, more of Nia than anything else. "She has her own space?" Patricia Glenn asked, looking at Nia's corner of the living room. "That's hers," Raymond said. "Bookshelves. Her art stuff. I sleep there when she has a friend over and takes the couch. Otherwise she has the bedroom." Patricia Glenn wrote something. He'd given Nia the bedroom. He hadn't thought of it as a sacrifice at the time. It was just logic. She needed the space more than he did. But standing in his living room, watching someone write it down in a formal assessment, he was aware of how it looked alongside a 4-bedroom house in Buckhead where the daughter's room was already painted and waiting. 3 days later, Sandra called. The report came back. He had known it was coming. He had known what it was going to say. But knowing a thing was coming and hearing the words were different operations. It noted the square footage, Sandra said, the single-bedroom configuration, your work hours, the absence of outdoor play space. And hers, the Brooks residence received a very positive assessment. Dedicated room for Naya already furnished. Fenced backyard, both adults present and employed. The report notes that the Brooks home represents a stable two-parent environment with resources appropriate for a school-age child. Raymond sat on the edge of his kitchen table. So we're losing. We're behind, Sandra corrected. That's different. We need something that tips the scales. Something that speaks to character in a way the home study can't quantify. A pause. Is there anything you haven't told me? Any documented community involvement, recognition? Anything that establishes you as something beyond a single father doing his best? He thought about it. And then, suddenly, he thought about Terry Coleman. He thought about a building on the east side of downtown. He thought about a basement he hadn't entered yet. He thought about a fire chief who'd handed him a business card 3 weeks ago and said, "You might want a copy of this." "There might be something," he said, "but I have to earn it first." It started with rain and a phone call at 2:07 a.m. On a Wednesday, Raymond had been asleep for 3 hours when his phone lit up the dark. He saw the number before he registered what it meant, and something happened in his chest that he'd been successfully managing for 3 weeks. A recognition that ran faster than thought. He answered before the second ring finished. Her voice came through shaking in a specific way. Not the controlled tremble of someone performing fear. The actual thing, Raymond. "I need help. There's a fire. Building 3 on Forsyth. The electrical system failed. The fire department can't locate why it keeps reigniting after they suppress it." He was out of bed before she finished the sentence. 15 minutes. You don't have to. I inspected that building 2 months ago. I know the system. 15 minutes. He pulled on jeans and a shirt and boots and grabbed his work bag from the hook by the door. His mother was already stirring on the sofa. She'd been staying over more frequently since the custody case started. A quiet arrangement neither of them had formally discussed, but both understood. He left a note on the kitchen counter. Emergency job. Back by morning, she would understand. He drove fast through empty streets. The scene was exactly what she'd described and worse. 2 fire trucks. A police unit blocking the block. Smoke pouring from the 4th floor of the 6-story building, thick and dark, and below it on the sidewalk, maybe 30 people in varying states of dress. Building tenants who'd evacuated. Some of them still holding phones and laptops and the specific items people grab when they have 30 seconds to decide what matters. Raymond found Laura near the fire chief, and the sight of her. No CEO composure anywhere. Hair in a hasty knot, jacket thrown over what looked like pajamas. Eyes tracking the building with the concentrated anxiety. Eye of someone watching 40 families' livelihoods and trying not to think about the structure itself. Hit him somewhere he'd been keeping carefully sealed. She saw him and something released in her face. Just briefly. Just for a second. Then, thank God. Captain Terry Coleman looked at Raymond with the frank assessment of a man who'd spent 20 years evaluating situations quickly. "Who are you?" "Raymond Harris. I'm the electrician who serviced this building 2 months ago. Full inspection and panel upgrade." He looked at Laura. "Can I see the schematics?" She pulled them up on her phone. Current architectural drawings, electrical layout, panel configurations. He studied them. Not long, 3 minutes maybe. There, he found it on the 3rd page. Backup generator. It's original to the building. Early 80s installation. It's behind the east utility wall in the basement. When the main power shuts down, the backup system tries to activate. If the neutral and hot wires are cross-connected, every reset attempt creates an arc flash. That's your reignition source. Coleman studied the page. "We'd have to go down to shut it off manually. Building's not stable," one of his lieutenants said. "Then we go fast." Raymond met Coleman's eyes. "I can find it and kill it in 10 minutes. I know the layout." The Coleman looked at him for a long moment. The calculation of a man who understood risk and also understood that standing outside watching a building burn was its own kind of loss. "Sanchez, get him geared up." Laura grabbed his arm. Her grip was firm. "Raymond, you don't." 40 families, Laura. He looked at her. "Just for a second. Long enough to mean it. I know how to do this." He went in with a firefighter named Rodriguez, who kept his flashlight steady and his breathing controlled and didn't ask questions once they were moving. The basement was hot. Not unbearable. The smoke was thinner down here than above, which told him the source wasn't structural. It was electrical, isolated, and if he found it, fixable. The east utility wall had a false panel that Raymond had noted during his original inspection as a feature from the building's previous configuration, before the 1994 renovation. Behind it, running on its own circuit, was a generator that looked like something from a time capsule. Original wiring. Rubber insulation gone brittle at the joints. And there, exactly as he'd suspected, a cross-connection at the neutral bar that someone had made in the 80s during an after-the-fact modification, and that no subsequent inspector had flagged because the generator ran so rarely that nobody had ever seen it fail in real time. Kill the fuel line first, he told Rodriguez. Then I disconnect the wiring. Rodriguez held the light. Raymond worked 7 minutes. He would think about this later. How the hands know what to do when the brain is occupied with other things. How years of working in conditions that required focus and speed had built a kind of physical memory that didn't require conscious direction. He traced the connections by feel as much as by sight. He found the cross-connection. He isolated it. He cut the last wire and the whole system went dark and silent. Coleman, Rodriguez said into his radio. Generators offline, a crackle. Then Coleman's voice, we're clear. Fire's out. Whatever you did down there, it worked. They climbed back up. Laura was exactly where he'd left her, standing 10 feet from the building entrance, and when he came through the door, she closed the distance in 3 steps, and her arms went around him hard, and he stood there in borrowed fire gear and the smell of smoke and let her. You're insane, she said, into his shoulder. Probably. You could have died, I didn't. She pulled back. Looked at him. Her eyes were wet, which was the only sign that what she was feeling had any edges to it at all. Thank you. Coleman appeared at his elbow and extended his hand. Hell of a job. That's a professional call under pressure, Mr. Harris. I'm writing this up in full. He pulled out a card. You want a copy of the report when it's done? Raymond looked at Coleman, then at the building, still standing, smoke-stained but structurally intact, 40 livelihoods still inside it. Then briefly, at Laura. Yes, he said. I'll want a copy. He drove home as the sun was starting. Gray light, empty streets. His mother was awake, standing in the kitchen with coffee, and she looked at him the way she'd looked at him when he came home from his first job at 16, measuring something, trying to determine the specific category of experience he'd just returned from. Emergency job, he said. Fire, her building. Patricia nodded slowly. You're okay, I'm okay. She handed him a cup of coffee and didn't ask anything else, which was one of the things he'd always understood about his mother. She knew the difference between the moment when a person needed to talk and the moment when they needed to simply be in the same room as someone who already knew them. He drank the coffee, standing up. Went to check on Naya, still asleep, one arm around the stuffed elephant she'd had since she was 3. Came back to the kitchen. Mom, she looked up. If this goes wrong in court, it won't. But if it does, he set the cup down. I need to know that what I've built with her, what we have, I need to know that's real, regardless of what a judge decides. His mother looked at him for a long time. Raymond, her voice was steady. That child has never once in her life gone to sleep wondering if her father loved her. That's not something a court gives you, and it's not something a court can take. She picked up her own cup. Now stop rehearsing disasters and think about what you actually need to win this thing. He thought about Terry Coleman and his business card. He called Sandra, the fire department report, he said when she picked up. If it documents what I did last night specifically and by name, does that help us? A pause. Send it to me when you have it and I'll assess. But Raymond, yes, potentially significantly. It speaks to character in a way that a home study can't manufacture. Another pause. How did you end up at a fire at 2 a.m? He chose his words carefully. I got a call. I knew the building. I was able to help. Sandra didn't press it. Get me that report, he called Laura. She answered before the first ring finished, which he registered without commenting on. The fire chief's report, he said. When he writes it up, does it name me directly? Yes. Her voice had recovered its steadiness. Mostly. There was still something underneath it that wasn't quite all the way back. He was very specific about your involvement. He said something like, "Building saved from total loss due to the expertise and quick response of the electrical contractor. I need a copy. I already requested one this morning." A pause. "Raymond, let me help with this. Just this one thing." He almost said no. The same reflex that had ended their last real conversation. But this was different. This wasn't her money or her lawyers, or anything that could be characterized as one person rescuing another. This was a document that existed because of work he had done. His competence, his knowledge, his decision to drive across the city at 2 in the morning because 40 families depended on a building he knew. "Okay," he said. "I'll send it when it arrives, Laura." She waited. "Thank you for calling me. A breath. You would have called me. If it were reversed." He thought about it. "Yeah, I would have." The report arrived 2 days later via courier. Official Atlanta Fire Department letterhead. Captain Terry Coleman's signature at the bottom. In the second paragraph, in language specific enough to be useful and professional enough to carry weight. Building 3 at 447 Forsyth Street was preserved from total structural loss as a direct result of the rapid identification and manual disabling of a faulty backup electrical system by contracted electrician Raymond Harris, who entered a potentially unstable structure and located the root cause of the recurring arc flash event that firefighting personnel had been unable to isolate. Mr. Harris's actions represented significant personal risk and a high level of professional expertise. He read it 3 times. Then he drove to Sandra's office and handed it to her and watched her read it once and then set it down and look up at him. "This is good," she said. "This is very good enough. It demonstrates character, competence, and something no amount of square footage can buy. The instinct to show up for people who need you at 2 in the morning without being asked." She made a copy for the file. "We're not where we need to be. But we're closer." She looked at him. "Is there anything else?" He thought about Laura. About what was and wasn't over. About the specific quality of her voice when she'd said you would have called me if it were reversed. About the fact that he was sitting in a public defender's office with a fire department report and trying to hold the line on something that was getting harder to hold every day. "No," he said. He went home and cooked dinner and helped Nia with a reading assignment and told her the story of a girl who found a hidden door in a library that led to somewhere nobody had mapped yet. A story he made up himself because she was tired of the books they'd already read, and she fell asleep in the middle of it with her mouth slightly opened and her fist curled under her chin. He sat in the doorway of her room for a while. The hearing was in 4 days. He thought about what Sandra had said. Character, the instinct to show up for people who need you. And he thought about a room full of canvases and a woman who had finally, after a very long time, let someone see them. And he thought about what it cost her to build a wall that high and what it had meant when she chose to let it come down. He thought about Naya at the kitchen table saying, she had a painting of something that looked like a storm, but it was blue. I liked that answer. He went to bed. He did not sleep well. But in the morning, when Naya stood beside him in the kitchen, wearing mismatched socks and a very serious expression, and asked if they could have waffles instead of eggs, because waffles were statistically better on Thursdays, he said yes. And that was enough. For now, that was exactly enough. The morning of the hearing, Raymond put on the suit, same one. Still didn't fit right across the shoulders. He'd had a week to get it altered and hadn't, partly because of time, and partly because some part of him had decided that walking into that courtroom in a suit that didn't quite fit was more honest than walking in wearing something borrowed. He was a man who fixed electrical systems for a living and raised a daughter alone in an 800-square-foot apartment and drove a truck with a dent in the passenger door from a parking lot in 2021 that he kept meaning to address. The suit was accurate. He dropped Naya at school first. She'd been quieter than usual at breakfast. Not sad. Naya had a different face for sad, a specific pulling inward that he recognized immediately. This was more like watchful, like she was paying attention to the texture of the morning and cataloging it for later. At the school door, she hugged him longer than usual. arms around his waist, face pressed into his jacket. "You okay, Peanut? Are you?" Her voice was muffled against the fabric. He crouched down. "Eye level. I'm going to be. Whatever happens today, you and me, that doesn't change. You understand?" She looked at him for a moment, searching his face the way she'd been doing since she was 4, looking for the gap between what he said and what he meant. She must have found them matching, because she nodded once, kissed his cheek, and walked through the school doors without looking back, which was its own kind of faith. The faith of a child who trusts so completely she doesn't need to watch. He sat in the car for 30 seconds, then drove to Capitol Avenue. Sandra was outside courtroom 4B with 2 coffees, which meant she was worried. She handed him one and looked him over with the practiced assessment of someone managing not just a case but the person carrying it. "How are you? Ready to be done with this?" That's the right answer. She glanced at the courtroom doors. They're already inside. Jeffrey Lewis filed a supplemental brief this morning. New exhibit, a comparison of the 2 school districts, test scores, extracurricular programs, the works. It's theater, but it'll be in the record. Can we respond? We have the fire report. We have your mother. We have Nia's teacher, who submitted a written statement. She paused. We have what we have. He nodded and drank the coffee, and didn't say what he was thinking, which was that what they had might not be enough, that the comparison between his life and Deja's life on paper was the kind of comparison that favored square footage, regardless of what happened inside it, that he'd done everything right for 5 years and was still walking into a room where the outcome wasn't guaranteed. He didn't say any of that. He drank the coffee. The doors opened. Deja was already seated at the petitioner's table when Raymond walked in, composed in the way she'd been at the first hearing, tailored, deliberate, the look of a person who had prepared for this moment across many months and arrived ready for it. Thomas Jackson sat in the gallery behind her, not at counsel table, which was the right call, keeping the lawyer husband visible but not deployed, a presence that communicated stability without overplaying the hand. Jeffrey Lewis was at the table sorting papers. He looked up when Raymond entered and gave a small, professional nod, not hostile, just acknowledging. The nod of someone who understood this was business. Raymond sat down beside Sandra. Judge Deborah White took the bench at 9:03, same reading glasses, same focused economy of movement. She'd read everything submitted before arriving. Raymond could tell, because she didn't spend time on the preliminary review that some judges used to settle in. She looked at both tables and opened. We're here on the continued matter of Brooks versus Harris. I've reviewed all submitted materials, including the supplemental brief from petitioner's counsel. She looked at Jeffrey Lewis. Counselor. You may proceed. Jeffrey Lewis stood. He walked the judge through the home study results with the precise, unhurried confidence of someone handling evidence he trusted completely. The square footage comparison, the school district ratings, the dedicated bedroom already furnished in the Brooks house, with a daybed and bookshelves and a window that looked out at the backyard. He presented photographs. He quoted from the social worker's report. He did not embellish. He didn't need to, Your Honor. The evidence establishes clearly that the Brooks household offers Nia an environment with resources, stability, and a 2-parent structure that simply cannot be matched in her current situation. Jeffrey paused. We are not here to diminish what Mr. Harris has done for his daughter. We are here to suggest that what he's done for 5 years, alone, under significant financial constraint, is precisely the argument for why Nia deserves more support, not less. My client is not asking to take Nia away from her father. She is asking to give her daughter what every child deserves. 2 parents who are present. It was good. Raymond had to sit with that. It was very good. Sandra stood and walked the judge through what Raymond had built. The school records, the pediatric visit log, the written statement from Nia's teacher, Mrs. Elaine Porter, who had been Nia's first-grade teacher and who had submitted 3 paragraphs that Sandra now read into the record. Nia Harris was a confident, socially engaged child who regularly mentioned her father in classroom discussions, who had, on the first day of school, produced a drawing of herself and her father cooking dinner that she'd explained to the class in detail. including the specific brand of pasta they used and why. Who had never once, in Mrs. Porter's observation, displayed the behavioral markers associated with children navigating unstable home environments. Nia Harris is a thriving child, Sandra said, and she is thriving because of what Mr. Harris has built with her. Then Sandra paused, reached into the folder, and placed Terry Coleman's fire report on the edge of the table. Your Honor, I'd like to submit one additional document, already provided to opposing counsel prior to this hearing. 4 weeks ago, at 2 a.m, Raymond Harris received a call about a fire at a commercial building on Forsyth Street. He drove to the scene. He reviewed the electrical schematics. He identified the source of a recurring arc flash that firefighting personnel had been unable to locate. And then, with the building structurally compromised, he went inside and manually disabled the faulty system. She handed the report to the clerk. This is the official Atlanta Fire Department incident report, signed by Captain Terry Coleman. In the second paragraph, Captain Coleman documents that the building was preserved from total structural loss due to Mr. Harris's actions. 40 tenant businesses operate in that building. 40 families depend on that income. Jeffrey Lewis stood. Objection, Your Honor. Heroism during a separate incident has no bearing on this petitioner's fitness as a parent. Judge White looked at him over her reading glasses. Actually, Counselor, character has direct bearing on parental fitness, and this document speaks to character in specific, documented terms. Objection overruled. She held out her hand for the report, and the clerk brought it to her, and she read it, not quickly. She actually read it. Then she set it down and looked at Raymond. Mr. Harris, I'd like to hear from you directly. He stood. His voice came out level. He hadn't rehearsed it. It was just true, Your Honor. I won't pretend my life is bigger than it is. My apartment is small. I work constantly. There have been nights I was so tired I fell asleep reading to Nia before she did, which she finds funny and which I have complicated feelings about. He paused. Let that settle for a moment. But I was there. I have been there every single day for 5 years. Not because a court order required it. Not because I was trying to build a case. Because she's my daughter and showing up is what that means. He didn't look at Deja. He'd decided that, before he came in, I've planned to tell Naya about her mother. I've always planned that, when she was old enough to hold it without it becoming the thing that defined her. That was my timeline. My judgment call as the parent who has been in the room. He met the judge's eyes. I'm asking this court to trust that judgment. Not because I've been perfect, because I've been present, and I intend to keep being present, whether this court rules in my favor or not, because that's not something I do for a judge. That's something I do because Nia wakes up every morning knowing her father is there, and I will not be the reason that changes. He sat down. Judge White wrote something. A full sentence, maybe 2. Then she looked at both tables. I'm going to call a brief recess. 30 minutes, the gavel came down. The hallway outside courtroom 4B had the specific kind of institutional quiet that felt louder than noise. Raymond sat in one of the bench seats along the wall, and Sandra sat beside him with the folder in her lap, and neither of them spoke for a while, which was the right call, because there was nothing to say that the next 30 minutes wasn't going to resolve one way or another. Then the courtroom doors opened. Not the judge. Not the bailiff. Laura Clark walked out. Raymond's first thought was, she wasn't here when I walked in, because she hadn't been. He'd looked. Not deliberately, or maybe deliberately, the way you scan a room for something you've told yourself you're not looking for. She hadn't been in the gallery when the hearing started, which meant she'd come in after. Which meant she'd been somewhere in this building, waiting, deciding, and then walked through those doors while he was still standing at the podium. She was in a charcoal suit, hair up, every professional inch of her assembled and precise, and she was walking directly toward Sandra with an envelope in her hand. Raymond stood. She handed Sandra the envelope without looking at Raymond first, which took something. He could see it in the set of her jaw, the deliberate sequencing of it. Task first, then him. Sandra opened the envelope. Read it. Her expression moved in a way Raymond had rarely seen it move, not dramatically, but with the specific recalibration of someone who had been running a calculation and just received a variable that changed the outcome entirely. Laura. Sandra's voice was careful. This is 5 months of documentation, Laura said. Her voice was steady, controlled in the way it was controlled when she was directing something. Email records, call logs, text message records. I had my assistant compile everything related to Raymond's work schedule on my properties going back to when we started. She looked at Raymond then. Finally. Every job, every timestamp, every instance of a scheduling adjustment. You can see the pattern. Sandra was already reading. Raymond said, "What pattern?" Laura looked at him. Direct. No professional distance, no careful management. Just her face and what was in it, which was something he recognized from a kitchen in late November when she'd told him she was tired of being safe. You never once started a major job before 3:15 p.m. Not on my properties. You scheduled everything around Nia's pickup. You turned down 3 after-hours emergency calls in the first 2 months because they conflicted with her schedule. I have the text messages where you explained that, and I have my responses accepting it. A pause. 5 months. 37 jobs. Every single one. Sandra looked up from the pages. This is admissible. This is very admissible. Her voice had a quality Raymond hadn't heard in it before. Something close to relief, Laura. Were you planning to testify? That's why I'm here, Raymond said. You can't. I know what I'm doing. Lewis is going to use this. He's going to say you're here because we were involved, that it's not objective. I know what he's going to say. She didn't waver. He's going to say I'm emotionally invested, and he's right. I am. But emotionally invested and factually accurate are not the same thing. This documentation is factual. What I observed over 5 months is factual. She held his gaze, Raymond. That lawyer was building toward one word: inadequate. I watched you walk into a burning basement at 2 a.m. to protect 40 families you'd never met. I'm not going to sit on the other side of a courthouse and let someone use that word about you. Sandra put her hand up. We don't have time for this conversation right now. The recess is 22 minutes, she looked at Laura. If you testify, Lewis will cross-examine you on the personal relationship. You understand that? Yes. And you're prepared for that? Yes. Sandra looked at Raymond. He looked at Laura. The hallway was very quiet and very bright, and he was aware of the specific quality of this moment. The feeling of standing at a threshold that, once crossed, could not be uncrossed. He didn't tell her not to. He'd learned, over 5 years of raising a daughter, that the moment you tried to stop someone from doing something brave on your behalf was the moment you dishonored both of you. He just said, "Thank you." She held his gaze for 1 more second. Then she turned and walked back to the courtroom doors. And Sandra was already on her feet, and 19 minutes later, Judge Deborah White was back on the bench. Sandra requested the addition of a witness and submitted the documentation simultaneously. Jeffrey Lewis objected immediately and with energy. Judge White read 3 pages of the document log while Lewis was still speaking, and when he finished, she looked at him over her glasses and said, "I'll note that opposing counsel has already referenced Ms. Clark by name in submitted background materials, which means her identity is not unknown to this proceeding. This documentary evidence speaks directly to the respondent's parenting conduct over a sustained period. I'm allowing it. You'll have full opportunity to cross-examine." She looked at Sandra. "Call your witness." Laura walked to the stand. She was sworn in. She sat. She placed her hands flat on the railing in front of her and looked at Sandra with the settled expression of someone who had made a decision and was on the other side of the making of it. Sandra walked her through it methodically, how they'd met, how long they'd worked together, what her role was, property owner, not employer in the traditional sense, which established the nature of her observation. And then, carefully, in the course of that professional relationship, what did you observe about Mr. Harris's scheduling? Laura answered, without consulting notes. She didn't need notes because she'd lived it. Raymond Harris never scheduled work on my properties that would conflict with picking up his daughter from school. 3:15 was the hard line. I knew it from the first consultation. He was transparent about it. He told me Nia's schedule was non-negotiable and structured his availability around it. She paused. I offered emergency overtime calls on 3 occasions in the first 2 months. He declined everyone that fell inside that window. I have the messages. The messages went into the record. In your observation, Sandra continued, was Mr. Harris consistent about this? Without exception. 5 months, 37 jobs across 6 properties. Not once. Sandra let that sit then. Miss Clark, you mentioned Mr. Harris came to assist at the building fire several weeks ago. Can you describe what you observed? And Laura described it, the call she'd made at 2 in the morning, his arrival at the scene, the speed with which he'd assessed the schematics, the decision he'd made to go into the basement. She described watching him come back out and the state she'd been in when he did, and she was precise about it. Not performative, not emotional in the way that performs emotion for an audience, but the specific, contained accuracy of someone describing something they had actually been through and would not pretend otherwise. He came, she said, because 40 families depended on that building. Not because I asked. Not because it was his job, because that's who he is. Someone who shows up when people need him. The courtroom was quiet. Jeffrey Lewis stood for cross-examination. He was measured about it. He'd been practicing law long enough to know that aggressive cross-examination of a credible witness could damage more than it helped. He was going to chip at the edges, not swing at the center. Miss Clark, you have a personal relationship with Mr. Harris, correct? We were in a relationship, yes. Were. Past tense, yes. When did that relationship end? When the custody petition was filed, she answered without hesitation. Raymond ended it. He was concerned that the relationship would be used exactly the way you're using it now. Lewis didn't pause. So you're here testifying on behalf of someone you were romantically involved with. I'm here presenting documented evidence and 5 months of direct observation. Her voice didn't shift. The documentation doesn't change based on my feelings, but your feelings exist. Yes, they do. She looked at him steadily. You're asking me to pretend that emotional investment invalidates factual accuracy. Those are different things. I've testified to what I observed, and I've provided the records that support it. If you'd like to challenge the accuracy of the records, I'm happy to walk through them. Lewis moved on. He knew he wasn't getting more from that line, Miss Clark. You are, by public record, a billionaire. That's accurate. And Mr. Harris has never asked you for financial assistance. Not once. Not even during the custody case. A case where the disparity in resources between his household and the Brooks household is central to the petitioner's argument. I offered to help when the case began. He declined. She paused. He specifically said he didn't want the relationship used as evidence of financial instability. Which tells you something about how he thinks? Another pause, shorter. He said no because he was protecting Nia, not his pride. His daughter. Lewis looked at his notes. Changed tack. But you're here testifying for him. I'm here telling the truth. Her eyes were on Judge White when she said it, not on Lewis. Deliberate. The truth about a man who turned down overtime work to pick up his daughter from school. The truth about a man who drove across Atlanta at 2 in the morning to protect people he didn't know because it was the right thing to do. I'm here because what I have to say is accurate and relevant. She paused. And because someone who made those choices deserves to have someone else choose to show up for him. The courtroom held that. Lewis looked at his notes for 3 seconds. Then, nothing further. Judge White called a 1-hour recess. Raymond found Laura in the hallway by the window that looked out at Capitol Avenue. The midday traffic slow and ordinary below them, the ordinary world continuing in its ordinary way, while inside everything felt extraordinarily suspended. He stood beside her. You should have told me, he said. You would have said no. You still should have told me. She turned to look at him. There was no apology in her face, which was right. Lewis was building toward a picture of a man who loves his daughter but can't give her what she needs. Small apartment, long hours, limited resources, no second parent. He was going to hand the judge that image and let it sit. She held his gaze. I have 5 months of records that say something different about who you are. I wasn't going to keep them in a file while someone used the word inadequate about you. He looked at her for a long moment. That thing you said on the stand, she waited. About someone who makes those choices deserving to have someone show up for them. He paused. You didn't have to say it that way. I said it because it's true. Lewis is going to use it. Let him. She looked back out the window. The judge saw the documentation before she heard anything personal. That's the order that matters. Sandra appeared at the end of the hallway, walking fast, folder under her arm. She looked at both of them, with the expression of someone processing a situation she'd been professionally trained not to have opinions about. That was risky, she said to Laura. But it was also the strongest testimony I've seen in a custody proceeding in years. She looked at Raymond. We're in better shape than we were this morning. I can't promise you more than that, he nodded. It's enough. They went back inside. The gavel came down at 2:17 p.m. Judge Deborah White had the unhurried certainty of someone who had made her decision in the recess and was now delivering it, not workshopping it in public. I've considered the full record in this matter, she said, including the supplemental materials submitted today. She looked at both tables. The petitioner, Ms. Brooks, has demonstrated genuine growth, stability, and what appears to be sincere desire to participate in her daughter's life. The court acknowledges that. Postpartum depression is a real and serious condition, and the court does not hold Ms. Brooks's absence against her in the sense of moral condemnation. Deja sat very still, however. The judge paused. One word carrying its full weight: parental rights are not restored by the passage of time alone. They are restored through demonstrated presence. Ms. Brooks has been absent from Nia's life for 5 years, not due to incarceration, not due to medical incapacity in an ongoing sense, but due to the decision, however understandably arrived at, to leave. That decision had consequences for Nia, and those consequences were absorbed entirely by the respondent. Raymond's hands were flat on the table. Mr. Harris has built something real with his daughter. The documentation submitted today. Both the fire department report and the scheduling records from Miss Clark establishes a pattern of conduct that is not easily manufactured and is not the result of legal preparation. It is the result of 5 years of daily choices. Judge White set down her papers. I am denying the petition for joint custody at this time. Something released in Raymond's chest. Sudden and total, like pressure that had been so constant he'd stopped noticing it until it was gone. Nia Harris remains in Mr. Harris's primary custody. Judge White looked at Deja directly. Ms. Brooks, I want to be clear. This ruling is not a permanent bar. It is a recognition of where things are now, not where they may be in the future. You are Nia's mother, and that matters. I am granting supervised visitation, 2 hours monthly at a neutral location, to be arranged through the clerk's office. If, after 6 months, you have established a consistent and positive relationship with your daughter, this court will review the question of expanded contact. She picked up her pen. I would encourage you to use that time well. She looked at Raymond last. Mr. Harris. Something in her voice had shifted, just slightly, from the formal register, not breaking it. Just acknowledging something at the edge of it. The scheduling records Ms. Clark submitted today. They were the clearest picture this court has seen in some time of what sustained parental involvement actually looks like in practice. Not in a speech. In a log, she held his gaze for a moment. Take care of your daughter. Yes, Your Honor. The gavel came down. In the hallway, Sandra shook his hand and then did something he hadn't expected, which was that she didn't immediately pivot to next steps. She just shook his hand and held it for a second and said, "You won the right way. I want you to know that." He thanked her. She went back inside to handle the paperwork. He stood in the hallway and let the building continue around him. The fluorescent hum, the other cases, the other people in plastic chairs waiting for their own outcomes, and tried to locate something like triumph, and found instead something quieter. Something that felt less like winning and more like being allowed to continue. Which was, he understood now, what he'd actually been fighting for. Not a victory. The permission to keep doing what he'd already been doing. Laura came out of the courtroom behind him. He turned. She stopped a few feet away. The composed exterior was still there, but the edges of it were different now, less like armor, more like something she was wearing, because she'd chosen it, rather than because she needed it. Her hands were at her sides. He closed the distance, and she let him pull her in, arms around her, her face against his shoulder. And they stood like that, in the middle of the 4th-floor hallway of a courthouse on Capitol Avenue. while people moved around them carrying folders and purposes. And neither of them said anything for a long time because nothing required saying yet. Then, into her shoulder. "Thank you," she said, quiet. "You already thanked me. I'm thanking you again." She pulled back slightly to look at him. Her eyes were dry. She'd been holding it together too long for anything to get through easily now. But there was something around her eyes, a loosening, the particular expression of someone who had done a difficult thing and come out on the other side of it. "Go get your daughter," she said. He looked at her. "Come with me," she blinked just once. "What?" "I want you to meet her, properly, not the way it's been. I want Nia to know who you are, not sneaking around it, not explaining it later. Now, Raymond, you just stood up in a courtroom and said that someone who shows up deserves to have someone show up for them." He held her gaze. "I'm asking you to come to the park, a long moment, the kind that has weight and shape and edges." "Okay," she said. Patricia was at Riverside Park with Nia, which was the plan Raymond had communicated to his mother that morning in the specific shorthand they'd developed over years. 3 words in a text, "Park after school," which meant, "Be there, be normal, don't make anything of it until I arrive and explain what kind of thing it is." He saw Nia on the swings from the parking lot. The way she pumped her legs with total commitment. The conviction that maximum effort was always the correct approach to any physical activity. She saw him and was off the swing before it stopped moving. Daddy, running, arms out. A full-speed collision into his midsection that he caught and lifted and held, and she was talking before she was even fully in his arms. Something about the longest day, something about fractions on a quiz, something about a disagreement during lunch that had been resolved by the invention of a new rule that nobody but Nia thought was fair, but everyone agreed to anyway. He held her. He let her talk. He breathed. Then he set her down. "Nia, I want to introduce you to someone." She looked up at him, then looked past him at Laura, who had hung back slightly, not timid, just giving him the space to do this in whatever order was right. Nia looked at Laura for a full 3 seconds, the assessing look. The one she used when she was loading information she intended to keep then. "You have paint on your sleeve." Laura looked down. She did, a small streak of cadmium yellow along the left cuff from the morning, from the studio, from a life that continued even when other things were happening. She looked back up at Nia. "I was working this morning and I didn't notice." "What were you painting?" "Something I've been working on for a while. I haven't figured out what to call it yet." Nia considered this with the gravity of someone who took naming seriously. "I make up names for my drawings even when I'm not sure. You can do that. The right name usually comes later anyway." Laura crouched down to Nia's level. Not condescending, just meeting her where she was. "That's actually very good advice, I know." Nia looked at Raymond with the directness she reserved for important questions. "Is she your girlfriend?" Patricia, who was now standing approximately 8 feet away, pretending to read something on her phone, made no sound whatsoever. Raymond looked at Laura. Laura looked at Raymond. He said, "Yeah, she is." Nia processed this, nodded once, with the decisive acceptance of someone who had asked a question, received an answer, and filed it under resolved. "Okay. Can we get ice cream?" "It's Thursday. Thursday is not a special ice cream day. It could be. We could make it one. Starting today." Laura stood, looked at Raymond with something quiet at the corner of her mouth. "She's right. Thursday has no particular claim to anything. It could be ice cream day." Raymond looked at his daughter. His daughter looked back with the expression she used when she thought she was about to win something. He looked at his mother, who had put her phone away, and was watching with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had been right about many things over many years, and was gracious enough not to say so out loud. "Ice cream," he said. Nia took off toward the parking lot at full speed, calling back specifications about acceptable flavors and unacceptable ones, and the general hierarchy of toppings. They got ice cream. They sat at a picnic table in the late afternoon cold, and Nia ate hers with the focused efficiency of someone who had waited long enough and wasn't going to be slowed down by weather. She talked about school and soccer, and a book series she'd started that had 7 volumes, and she intended to read all of them before the end of the year, which Raymond privately calculated Was not going to happen but didn't say. Laura listened. Not politely. Actually listened. The way she listened when something interested her. Asking questions about the book characters by name. Asking which volume was best. Asking whether the ending of the series was satisfying, or the kind of ending that left you feeling cheated. Nia stopped mid-bite. Looked at Laura. You actually want to know? I actually want to know. Nia considered this. Then launched into a detailed summary of the entire first volume that lasted 11 minutes and included character motivations, plot foreshadowing she'd noticed on a second read, and her theory about what the author was going to do in volume 4. Laura listened to all of it. Raymond watched his daughter talk to this woman. Watched the ease of it, the complete absence of performance on either side, and understood something he hadn't had words for until now. Nia didn't know what Laura was in dollars or in column inches or in the specific register of Atlanta's social landscape. She just knew that Laura looked at her drawings in a studio and answered questions honestly, and had paint on her sleeve, and listened like what you said mattered. Weak was, he thought, the only version of anyone that Nia had ever needed. Patricia appeared beside him, while the two of them were deep in the book conversation, and said, very quietly without looking at him, "She's good for you, I know. And you're good for her." His mother paused. "I can see it from here. The way she holds herself differently when you're close to her." He looked at Laura. She was leaning slightly forward at the picnic table, elbows on the wood, fully engaged with whatever Nia was explaining about a fictional kingdom's political system. "Yeah," he said. "I think so too." His mother patted his arm once and went to throw away her cup, and said nothing else about it, which was its own form of approval. That night, after the ice cream and the drive home and Nia asleep in the back seat before they crossed Ponce de Leon, Raymond sat at his kitchen table. Not because he couldn't sleep, because he wanted to be awake for this part. He was looking at an envelope that had appeared in his mailbox that evening. Slid through the slot while they were at the park, the handwriting on the front unmistakable. He'd seen it when he carried Nia inside and put her to bed, and he'd set it on the kitchen table and made a cup of tea and sat down with it. He opened it now, 3 pages, handwritten, not typed, not through a lawyer. Deja's actual handwriting, the script he'd known from grocery lists and birthday cards, and the note she'd left the morning she walked out, which he'd kept for 3 years before deciding to let go of it. She wrote, "I don't expect you to forgive me. I'm not even sure I'm writing to ask for that. I'm writing because there are things I need you to know that have nothing to do with the petition and everything to do with Nia." She wrote about the morning she left, about the specific texture of the fear she'd been living inside. Not just the depression, which was real, but the fear underneath the depression, which was that she was going to fail Nia in ways that couldn't be repaired, that the harm she might do was greater than the harm of her absence. That this was a calculation she'd made at 23 years old, in a state of crisis, and that she understood now how wrong it was, but that she needed him to know it hadn't been indifference. It had been a terrible kind of love. The kind that decides to leave because it doesn't trust itself to stay. She wrote, "You gave her what I couldn't. I know that. I've known it for years. I'm not asking you to make room for me faster than Nia needs. I'm just asking. When the time is right, when she's ready, let her know I didn't stop loving her. I just didn't know how to be with her yet. I know how now. I'm still learning. But I know now, the last line. What you've done for her is the most important thing anyone has ever done in my presence. Thank you for doing it." Raymond set the pages down on the table. He sat with it, the complicated weight of it. The fact that the woman who had left him holding a 2-year-old and a stack of unpaid bills had also, apparently, been holding her own version of something unbearable. That both things could be true. That she had done something that had cost them both enormously, and had also been a person in pain when she did it. That Nia was going to ask questions one day, and the answers were going to be layered in the way adult things are layered. And his job, when that day came, was to give her the truth in a shape she could carry without it crushing her. He folded the letter carefully and put it in the drawer where Nia's important documents lived. Her immunization records, her birth certificate, the small card from the hospital the day she was born. It belonged there. in the same place. He'd know when to take it out. 3 days after the hearing, Sandra called with one piece of information she said she was sharing. Informally, not officially, because she thought he should have it. I ran into Judge White's clerk at a continuing education seminar yesterday, Sandra said. We got to talking. Off the record, the way these conversations sometimes go, a pause. The scheduling documentation. The judge said it was the clearest picture she'd seen in years of what sustained parental involvement actually looks like in practice. Not testimony, not character witnesses. A log? Sandra let that sit. She specifically said it was unusual to see that kind of evidence because it wasn't assembled for a case. It was just what was true. Raymond looked at the kitchen table, 5 months of texts, of Laura confirming his schedule adjustments without complaint, of him explaining, simply and without drama, that 3:15 was the line. Just daily decisions, logged without knowing they were being logged, without knowing they would ever matter to anyone except the 7-year-old who needed to be picked up on time. Thank you for telling me, he said. Thank you for being the kind of person whose record looked like that, Sandra said. And then she hung up. 6 months later, Raymond was in the guest wing, not fixing anything this time. He'd finished all the electrical work months ago. He was there because Laura had asked if he'd add 2 more adjustable fixtures along the north wall, where she'd started working on a larger series of paintings. And the coverage from the existing track wasn't quite reaching the upper right corner of the canvases. It was a 40-minute job. He'd done it while Nia sat at a small drafting table that had appeared in the studio. Sometime in the last 2 months, child height, with a rolling stool and a proper set of art supplies, organized in a way that suggested someone had thought about it carefully over time. Watercolors and colored pencils, and a set of fine tip markers in more shades than Raymond had known existed. Nia used them with the concentration of someone who took her work seriously and didn't like to be interrupted. Laura was at the main easel, working on something large. Blues again, but different from the storm painting he'd first seen all those months ago. These blues had more variation in them. Lighter at the edges, deeper at the center, the kind of blue that suggests not weather, but depth. More deliberate light throughout. The studio smelled like paint and clay, and the particular aliveness it always smelled like. Except now it also smelled like the apple juice box Nia had finished an hour ago and left off on the edge of her table, and like the markers she'd left uncapped for 3 minutes. Before Laura quietly put the caps back on without saying anything, and like the specific combination of people who had been in a space together, long enough to leave evidence of themselves. Laura's house had become their house sometime in the last 2 months, not through a formal announcement or a dramatic conversation. Through the accumulation of small things that had no clean starting point. A toothbrush that stayed, a drawer that got cleared, a key that was copied without discussion, because not having one had started to seem strange. Raymond would have been hard-pressed to name the exact day. He suspected Laura would have been too. Some transitions don't have a date. They just arrive, and you look up one afternoon and realize you've already been living inside them for a while. Raymond climbed down from the ladder and flipped the new fixtures on. The north wall lit up. The canvases along it came into their full color for the first time. The blues resolved. The edges of the unfinished pieces became clear. The work that had been partially visible now fully visible in a way that changed what it was. Laura stopped working and looked at them. Her head tilted slightly. "Better," she said. "Told you it would be." She smiled without turning around. "You always say that. I'm always right." She set down her brush and crossed the room to look at the placement of the second fixture, which she'd had opinions about. And as she walked past him, she let her shoulder touch his arm in the easy, unthinking way of people who have gotten comfortable with each other's proximity without having to think about it anymore. Nia, from her table, without looking up from whatever she was making. "Daddy? Yeah. Is it almost dinner time?" "Almost. What are we having? What do you want?" A very long pause. This was a ritual. The pause always lasted longer than it needed to. "Pasta," Nia said. "But with that sauce. Not the jarred one. The jarred one is fine. It's fine, but it's not as good. Laura knows the real one." Raymond looked at Laura. Laura looked at Raymond. a beat. I've shown you the real one twice, Laura said to Nia. It has too many steps, Nia said. Daddy has to learn it. Then he can make it whenever. She's making me teach you, Laura said. She's been doing that for 3 weeks, Raymond said. I noticed, Nia, still not looking up from her work, with the satisfied expression of a person whose plan was unfolding correctly. It's a good sauce. He should know it. Raymond looked around the studio, at the canvases and the paintings in progress, and the light doing what good light does, when it's placed correctly. Not just illuminating the surface, but giving the colors what they needed to be what they actually were. At Nia's drafting table, with its cup of markers, and the half-finished drawing of what appeared to be a horse with extremely ambitious wings, and a tail that was also somehow a river. At Laura, standing near the north wall, with paint on her hands and bare feet on the drop cloth, and nothing of the CEO anywhere in the room. Just Laura. He thought about a Tuesday morning 6 months ago. A flickering light. 8 minutes of work, and a question nobody had asked him before, and a door that closed, and the strange weight of a conversation that should have meant nothing and hadn't. He thought about what he'd said to her that first afternoon in her sitting room, taking notes in his good notebook, explaining why he'd gotten into the work. You fix something, and it stays fixed. Which was true about wires and connections and faulty systems, and the kind of errors that looked complicated but had simple sources once you knew where to look, and which was also, he understood now, true about people. About, the ones who had worn down to something essential after years of holding everything carefully. About the light that got dim and irregular, not from any catastrophic failure, but from a small loose thing. A connection that had never been secured properly the first time, that just needed someone patient enough to come in and find it and put it right. He thought about Nia, in the park, on a Thursday afternoon, saying the right name usually comes later anyway. And about Laura hearing it with an expression he now understood had been recognition. I'll learn the sauce, he said. Laura looked at him. Something in her expression was open in the way it had been that first night in a kitchen with 2 glasses of wine. Except that version had been fragile, testing whether the air was safe. This version was settled. Like something that had been uncertain had been resolved, quietly, by the simple accumulation of days. It has a lot of steps, she said. I've done complicated things before. She handed him the paintbrush she was holding, not for any practical reason. Just put it in his hand. You have, she said. You really have. Nia, from the drafting table, with the authority of someone who had been managing this situation from the background for months, and was satisfied with how it had developed. Can we have bread with it? The thick kind? Yes, Raymond said. And can Laura eat with us? Raymond looked at Laura. Laura looked at Raymond. Laura lives here, he said. And then, because it was true and because he was done finding sideways approaches to true things, he said it again, simply. She lives here. Nia looked up from her drawing for the first time in 40 minutes. Looked at him. Looked at Laura. Looked back at her drawing. Arrived at whatever conclusion she arrived at, which appeared to take about 2 seconds. Okay, she said. Then she can make the sauce. She can teach me the sauce, Raymond said. I'll make it. That's slower. Most good things are. Nia considered this with the seriousness of a child who was genuinely evaluating whether it was true. Then she went back to her drawing. The horse with the impossible wings and the river tail, and whatever else she was adding now, in a shade of green he hadn't seen her use before. Raymond looked at Laura. She was already looking at him. He didn't say anything else. Some things didn't need the additional weight of words. He'd spent enough of his life saying exactly what was required and no more. In service calls, in court, in the specific in the specific economy of a single father running on not quite enough of everything. He'd learned the difference between things that needed to be said and things that were already said by the fact of being here. He put the paintbrush on the work table, went to pick up his tools. The new fixtures ran clean and warm, and exactly where they needed to be. The light landing on everything, without casting the wrong shadows, the room finally and fully itself. Outside, the late afternoon was doing something generous with the light. Gold coming through the glass at the angle that only happens for about 20 minutes before it's gone. Not borrowed, not fleeting in the way that felt like a warning. just the particular quality of light that arrives when the day has settled into what it is, when everything that was going to happen has happened, and what's left is the quiet fact of being here. Naya hummed something to herself at the drafting table, tuneless, contented. The sound of a child who is exactly where she is supposed to be. Raymond picked up his toolbox. Laura turned back to the north wall and picked up her brush and looked at the painting for a moment, the new blues, the deliberate light, the thing she'd been working toward for a long time now, and made one small adjustment near the upper right corner, and then stepped back and looked at it again. Better, the light stayed on.